It's time to engage your brain and enter the mind's eye, your one-stop shop for politics to paranormal and everything in between. I'm your humble host, Brian Turnov, and you're listening to Z Talk Radio. About a month and a half or so, I was visiting an old college friend for his wedding. Congratulations, George, by the way. And another old friend of mine happened to be visiting there at the same time. She was attending or working FairyCon, some convention to that effect. And she gave me a few free tickets to go see her and visit her so we can catch up. Once I got through the doors, I was blown away by the costumes, the people. A big part of the population, which I then obviously learned as I was going through, was the steampunk community. And I've heard of steampunk before, but it's never something I really saw face to face. But the intricacies of these people's costumes, the care, the characters, the community, it seemed larger than life in many ways. And I've been part of a few communities before, particularly the paranormal one. I was into a lot of conventions. Did a lot of ghost hunting across the United States. And this was a very long time ago. And it was fun, and there were characters, of course, but nothing like this. Everyone was their own character. They really loved their costumes and the care and the intricacy of some of these costumes. I was blown away, quite frankly. And the one name I kept seeing and hearing was Spring-Heeled Jack. I've seen this come across my desk a couple times, this urban legend from the 1800s. Then after just a simple type of his name, Spring-Heeled Jack, I came to realize that he was an inspiration for a slew of creative people, and even whole communities like the one we just talked about. So I said, hey, this has got to be worth more investigation. And so that brings us to our first guest tonight in our double shot. It's December 15th, and in the first hour, we're joined by author John Matthews. We'll talk about his latest book, The Mystery of Spring-Heeled Jack, From Victorian Legend to Steampunk Hero. We're going to investigate the many theories about the mysterious identity of Spring-Heeled Jack, who first came to terrorize Victorian London and nearby in 1838, from tales of wheels of fire for eyes and breath of blue flames, from springing over multiple stories and walls, and sometimes even physically attacking women. But despite the numerous sightings through 1904, he was never captured or identified. But it didn't even stop then. Encounters continued well into the 20th and 21st century, including some indirect connections to Jack the Ripper and Slender Man. And Spring-Heeled Jack wasn't the only huge influence from the Victorian era on to today. Just next door, and a little hop over the English Channel, an occult movement was occurring that would go on to deeply influence many well-known cultural movements. Tobias Chardin stops by to dish on his newest book, Occult Paris, The Lost Magic of the Belle Epoque. The Victorian era of the 19th century, it really was like no other period preceding it. Let's start with the sinister urban legend of Spring-Heeled Jack with John Matthews. The Mind's Eye returns after this quick break. Speaking of London, in 1952, a killer fog covered the city, ultimately killing thousands, and at least 10 times that were hospitalized. London is known for the fog cover, but for that instance and event, it was poisonous, and no one really knows why. Until now. Recently, a team of researchers has possibly determined and discovered the likely reasons for its formation. And while we're speaking of discoveries and the strange, a never-before-seen H.G. Wells ghost story is about to be published for the first time. You can get both of those great articles on our social media pages, facebook.com/Mind's Eye Show, and our Twitter handle @Mind's Eye Show. If you're kind of sick of social media or just want a little bit more from the Mind's Eye, we got not only great articles like this, blog entry, upcoming guests, archives, a little bit of everything, and it's all free. Go to themindseyemedia.com. Again, themindseyemedia.com. All right, I won't keep you guys waiting anymore. Up next, John Matthews and I try to solve the mysterious case of Spring-Heeled Jack. Back in a few minutes. This is The Mind's Eye. Now joining The Mind's Eye is author John Matthews, author of over 100 books on myths, fairies, the Arthurian legends, and Grail studies. He's been the advisor to Jerry Bruckheimer on King Arthur. You've seen him on History Channel, Discovery Channel, and on top of all this, he is a BAFTA winner. And as a former educator, for those who know, that is a very prestigious award. So we're very happy to have him on the show. John, thanks so much for joining us on The Mind's Eye.
It's great to be here.
The pleasure's all ours. So we're going to talk about your book, The Mystery of Spring-Heeled Jack, From Victorian Legend to Steampunk Hero. And as we just mentioned, this is a bit of a departure for you. Not a complete departure, I guess, but certainly different from what I guess you usually write about on your topics. How'd you get turned on to the legend? And then we'll explain what the legend is.
Well, it was really one of those things that, as you said, it's a little off the usual beaten track for me, and that's one of the reasons why I enjoyed writing it so much. It was nice to get away from King Arthur and the Middle Ages for a while. But basically, I'd known about this story for some years. I kept coming across it when I was researching other things, and I thought, well, why is there no book on this? Why has no one gone into it in depth? And I found a couple of very academic versions, real tomes. I thought, well, okay, here's a gap. Time I filled it.
That's simple, huh? Well, I mean, besides the fact that it is a fascinating story and it's still relevant today, even a century and a half later. Tell us what the legend of Spring-Heeled Jack is, and really, why is it so relevant today? Why should the listeners really even care?
Well, the legend starts in 1838 in a rather down-at-heel part of London called Peckham, where there were sightings of a strange ghostly figure who would suddenly leap over walls or hedges, appear out of nowhere, laugh maniacally, flashing lights could come from his eyes, fire from his mouth, and then he'd vanish again. And 2 or 3 of these sightings happened between the 9th of January and the 22nd of January of that particular year. And people began to get frightened. There was a very brief report, someone writing in scandalized disgust to one of the London newspapers saying, why is no one doing anything about this? Why isn't the Lord Mayor sorting it all out? And before you knew where you are, you had this huge story that just went on growing of these mysterious attacks. And somehow, ever since then, the story's never really gone away. I mean, it's not that they're exactly the same versions of the story, but it seems as though right up to the present time, people are still running into this character or versions of this character and still finding him terrifying, even although he doesn't kill people, he doesn't do any great harm, but he appears and disappears in this mysterious way.
You got the name Spring-Heeled Jack. Go a little bit more into that specifically. Spring-Heeled, why? It'll seem very obvious after you explain it, but then more so Jack. Of all names to pick, why Jack? Why not Brian? Why not John?
Well, yes. Well, of course, he's called Spring-Heeled Jack because of his ability to jump. Basically, he's able to jump from enormous heights up the walls of buildings, over high hedges and walls, and he simply leaps out from the darkness, appears and then disappears again. Why Jack? Well, that's one of the things that really interested me when I was doing my research, because the idea of Jack, the Jack figure, goes right back into much earlier times. It goes right back, in fact, to the good old days that I usually am writing about, when you have folklore characters who are called this. Of course, you've got Jack of Jack in the Beanstalk. You've got clever Jack who kills giants. You've got mysterious Jacks who do mysterious things, who come and disappear. It seems like it's a name that's given to anybody who is a bit unusual, a bit odd. I don't know if you're familiar with the term Jack the Lad. It's probably quite a British one, but it's one that is usually given to someone who's a little bit clever, a little bit dodgy, a little bit suspect. So I think that idea has been going for a long time. And also, of course, you've got Jack in the Boxes, which I think may be a significant part of this myth.
Jack is something that's rooted in myth and folklore, and fitting the parameters of folklore. I guess Spring-Heeled Jack would fall under the trickster.
So, yes, he falls in line with the fairy tale characters like Puck and those, you know, who are tricksters and who can again fly around and appear and disappear very easily.
The person who made it, I guess, dubbed the name Spring Heel Jack, were they alluding to folklore or something else?
I think it probably came from early history and from folklore very specifically, but there's no one point at which someone says, I'm going to call him Jack, I'm going to call him Spring-Heeled Jack. It's simply in the very first report you get in the London Times in 1838, you've got someone saying, who is this mysterious character, Spring-Heeled Jack, who's appearing everywhere at the moment, terrifying people. So it's as though he comes on the scene complete with his own name and identity.
Urban legends, as you alluded to before, I mean, they're a bit of telephone games. With each telling, some element of the story changes, and the Spring-Heeled Jack itself morphed over time again and again. On one part, at first, it seems like people are scared of him, but then he also becomes a hero of sorts. He's revered by the lower class. He's hated by the upper class. And depending on who you ask, he's either an anti-hero or a scourge. And like you said, there were no actual violent attacks that at least we know of for fact. So, was he even a good guy or a bad guy? I mean, how do we define him?
I think it's one of those characters who's halfway between one and the other. He's a grey figure in a way. As I said, it's interesting that unlike, for instance, the much more fearsome and terrifying Jack the Ripper, with whom there is a connection, I'll come on to in a minute, he doesn't kill anybody. He does occasionally rob houses, but not in a kind of drastic way. He does leap out and he does frighten women and he does occasionally rip their garments, and he has long talons that he's able to do this. And of course, we're looking at the Victorian era, you know, when women were rather more subject to fear and terror perhaps than they would be now. So you get these poor ladies reduced to gibbering wrecks because they'd been face to face with Spring-Heeled Jack. But as I said, he doesn't really do any harm to anyone, and it's very odd. There's almost a kind of, well, as you said yourself, it's a story that grows in the telling, because you start out with these few sightings and then suddenly he's everywhere. He's all over London, and then he moves out beyond London into the north of England and appears there for a while, and then he just disappears from history in the same way that he appeared, completely mysteriously, for a long time.
Let's play good detectives, and anytime we investigate an urban legend on the show, we try to, in really any subject matter, we try to bring as many primary sources as there are. And most witnesses and most encounters of Spring-Heeled Jack weren't primary, and even the ones that were fairly unreliable due to the nature and swiftness of the crime. Let's talk about those, the ones that at least were primary.
Well, you do get, I mean, the interesting thing is there was a lots of talk about, hysterical women and how they were making it up and trying to get attention. But in fact, most of the people who report carefully on the attacks were very respectable. You know, there was a clergyman's daughter attacked in Brentford. There was some young ladies who were chaperones and teachers for children. These were not kind of, if you like, the poor end of the market. They weren't prostitutes. They weren't kind of shady women. They were very respectable women. And the reports that you get in the newspapers, and I managed to assemble pretty much every one that was, and there were a lot, all have these things in common. You know, it's as though the story is going on and growing in the telling, but not varying enough, for my ideas anyway, for it to be made up.
You talked about the reliability of some of the encounters. Teachers, these are very reliable people. After one encounter that sticks out in the book while reading it was a report of Spring-Heeled Jack from the military. A few military men, not just one, but a few had an encounter. Go into some of the details there, because to me I always find people from that position to be very reliable, because they just have to deal with the facts and nothing but the facts.
Well, I mean, again, it depends how you look at the story. This is about Spring-Heeled Jack's appearance at Aldershot Barracks in 1877. Aldershot Barracks at that time was the main camp for the British Army in the London area, although it's actually just outside. But basically, two guards were on duty one night at the gates of the camp, and suddenly they saw this mysterious figure. And it's interesting because their description is quite detailed, as you'd expect, as you say, from someone trained to notice things. And he's wearing a tight-fitting suit. He has almost a kind of circular helmet on his head, and he leaps over the gates, knocking the soldiers down. And they fire at him, and he's not touched by the bullets, leaps off across and vanishes. Now, this led a few people to say, oh, I'm not so sure, he might have been either a ghost or the devil, or could he have been an alien? And that idea, of course, was then picked up much later on. We can come back to that shortly, but in the 60s he became recognized as an alien.
I want to come back to that one for a little bit when we go into what the possible explanations of the culprits were. Now, obviously, at this military case, no one was ever caught, just like all the other reports. With the encounters, was there any actual ever physical evidence left behind?
Once or twice there were things like there was a lantern left behind at one point, which one of the people who'd been attacked said had been carried by Spring-Heeled Jack. But of course, this was in the days before fingerprinting, so no one could do anything with that. But he never seems to have left any real signs other than the physical signs that were, on the persons of those he attacked. So, for instance, the women who very often had their clothing ripped would appear, indeed, with their clothing in ribbons, with scratches across their chests or faces. So that, in a sense, it wasn't just something they were making up. There were very clearly that kind of physical evidence, but the whole mystery is that there is, in a way, nothing there. It's almost like he really is a ghostly figure, because we never find out who he is. He's never caught. Various people were arrested at different times and brought to court, and then usually the whole thing was thrown out because the person had an alibi, or there was nothing to support any such identification. There was, in fact, a character in the army barracks that we were just talking about, who someone had suggested could have been playing a game and could have been him, but that was disproved as well, and no one worked out if it was him. How did he manage to do this great leap over the gates, which were about 8 foot high? So it's mysterious again.
Was there anything at the time that could actually make someone jump so high? Because, I mean, there were reports of him jumping a couple stories at a time. I mean, 20-foot fences, obviously something that regular humans couldn't be. But was there anything technology invention-wise that could allow something to happen during the time, particularly during Victorian London?
Not that we've ever come across. I mean, there were various suggestions at various times about how it might have been achieved by trickery. Particularly the old mirror trick. It's what people say, it's all done with mirrors. Well, there is a technique that's well known among magicians, that enables you to have a mirror at a particular angle which projects the image of the person standing by the mirror into the air, so that it makes it look as if they're actually there. And then the person in front of the mirror makes a gesture, does a jump, and it looks much bigger. It looks as though the whole thing is happening right in front of you. It's a very early kind of stage trick. But even with this, it does require a very powerful lamp. It requires a very bright image to be able to throw the appearance into the sky in that way. So that was pretty much discarded, I think, as evidence.
It definitely wouldn't make any sense. Obviously, he would have to have everything set up. And he is, I guess, we use Spring-Heeled Jack, but who even really knows if it was a he or she or what? But even from the beginning, with these type of unsolved mysteries, it almost gets a life of its own in a way. Even from the beginning, people were claiming that a conspiracy was being held and it was being covered up.
Oh, yes. I mean, it's the old story, I mean, as soon as something like that happens, then everybody starts writing to the press or complaining and saying, why is no one doing anything about this? Why has he not been caught yet? We have scenes where there are gangs of men roving through the streets of London with clubs looking for Spring-Heeled Jack, and then someone will run up and say, he's been sighted in the next street. And they'd all run off down to the next street, and of course there was no one there. But this got to such a point that even the great Duke of Wellington, Victor of Waterloo, who was in retirement then in his 80s, apparently came out and led a kind of manhunt through the streets of London. Still didn't manage to find anyone.
And people would even use Spring Hill Jack as an excuse to cover up crimes.
I think so, yes. I mean, mysterious burglaries that happened, and then you'd hear something about someone had been seen leaping 2 stories at a window, but then nothing was ever found, no indication, no imprints on the ground, nothing. So even for the early police force, who were just, still a bit hampered by not having modern technology, couldn't find any sign of anything. I guess they needed Sherlock Holmes. Anybody to help out. I mean, this is a story that's, like we said, goes up to this time, but it was around 60 years within, I guess, Victorian London, Victorian England. And even as it goes on, everybody starts talking about him. Even Jack the Ripper. Talk about the connections to Jack the Ripper later on. Yes, well, of course, Jack the Ripper comes along quite a while, nearly 50 years after these sightings. But what's interesting about that is that in one of the letters that he's supposed to have sent to Inspector Abline, the man who was hunting for him, and of course we don't know whether they're genuine or not, but there's no reason to suppose that they're not, he actually signed himself Spring Hill Jack and said, "I'm back." So, even whoever Jack the Ripper was aware of those older stories, and was quite happy to trade in on the fame of his namesake.
To me, the scariest part of the story is that Spring Hill Jack could be anyone, anytime, anywhere. So, in that sense, he is a villain, and he is representative of an inherent fear of sorts. Is that the reason why you think Jack the Ripper maybe referenced him? Because to try and bring fear into people, because he could be anyone, anytime, anywhere.
Yeah, I think so, because I think the whole idea, you have to remember that people had long memories, and that folk tradition lasted for hundreds of years and didn't just disappear. People remembered that there were stories, even if they didn't know the details. They remembered the old tales about these strange characters from the past, and they certainly remembered the stories about the sightings between 1838 and 1873, 1877, that were also widely reported in the press. And of course there were also these little books called Penny Dreadfuls, which were kind of very cheaply produced, almost like early magazines in a way, like early comic books, I suppose you could say, which always told the most lurid and extraordinary stories. And Spring Hill Jack, of course, was a hero of those. Just as the characters in the recent TV series, they draw upon all these different characters and make them still valid.
Why is that? Because he is so popular today. He's used in pop culture throughout all the mediums, and today he's extremely popular within the steampunk community. I'm not really quite sure what the steampunk community is, even after being told what it is. But why is he viewed in such a positive prism, or like he is such a hero? Even though he never technically did anything violent, but even today, he's revered as a hero.
Well, I think you put your finger on it when you said that he came to be something of a hero for the downtrodden people. This was a time, remember, when, people were still remembering the French Revolution and thinking about how hard-pressed they were. And, of course, they were at that period, too. The poor were very, very badly treated and lived terrible lives. And to have the idea of someone who could, as it were, thumb his nose at the establishment, and who only ever seems to have attacked wealthy people. You never hear about him attacking poor people. So I think from that you can very easily see how he could become a hero. And I think he's, he has his dark side without a doubt in more recent times. And obviously the association with Jack the Ripper made him probably anything but a hero for a while. But again, I think there's always this sense of people feeling that, there's a hero out there. It's been observed quite a few times, including by me in my book, that there's obviously a kind of prototype here which becomes very recognizable today in the form of Batman. Now, I don't know whether Gil Kane, who created Batman, had ever read about Spring Hill Jack. I suspect he must have. because if you look back at some of the pictures from the Victorian period, and there's a selection of them in my book, you'll see that he's very often portrayed as having bat-like wings and horns, and have been virtually able to fly, not just leap high. So it's not a big step from that to Batman. And there again, in the Batman character, you have someone who protects the weak.
With the sightings, we've talked a lot about Victorian England, but what about outside of Victorian London and Victorian England at the time? Did Spring Hill Jack come to America at all? Kind of like Neil Diamond. Did he come to America?
Yeah, he did. He did come to America. Yes, I mean he went after, I think, the last real sighting in England was in 1879, and then we didn't see anything at all or hear anything about him until 1904. When he appeared for a little while, and then during the war, interestingly, during the Second World War, he reappeared, or at least a character very like him reappeared in Prague when he became known as the Spring Man, and he became something of a kind of anti-German hero, hero of the resistance movement. So even then, people were seeing this character who could leap out from nowhere, knock a German helmet off or something like that, and then disappear again. But after that, 1945, in fact, at the end of the Second World War, he made his first appearance in Provincetown, Cape Cod, in Massachusetts, and there he was sighted leaping over buildings. And oddly enough, in the very first newspaper reports that you get from that period, immediately they are saying, this must be Spring Heel Jack. He's come to America from England. So they knew about him. The story was still relevant even then. And he went on appearing intermittently. In 1951, he appeared in Baltimore in Maryland, and he was called the Phantom. And he was seen then leaping over buildings. And people went out in the street or kept watch, and they would see this figure leaping high in the air, vanishing over buildings. And it was at this point, I think, that people started to think about the possibility that he might be an alien. So you get in the 1960s, you get one of the great ufologists. Gosh, his name's gone out of my head for the moment.
John Keel.
John Keel, there's the guy. Yeah, John Keel wrote a very influential article about Spring Heel Jack, in which he said he must be an alien from a planet with greater gravity, because that would enable him to leap so high. So you've got a little echo of Superman here as well. And he was so persuasive that a lot of people really seriously began to believe that Spring Heel Jack must have been an alien who was stranded on this planet at some point in the past and lived to be a great age and still had this power to appear and disappear, to leap into the sky, to leap over buildings and walls and fences.
Let's hold it right there. Let's actually try and solve this case, at least to the best of our abilities, while you're here. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we're gonna take a look. We're gonna try and solve the case from every angle, supernatural, real. We'll be back in just a moment with author John Matthews on his book, The Mystery of Spring Heel Jack. This is The Mind's Eye. Welcome back to The Mind's Eye. You're joining me, Brian Turnoff, and of course, the one and only author John Matthews. We're discussing his book, The Mystery of Spring Heel Jack, and we're going to try and solve the case of one of the biggest urban legends in the past 2 centuries. And reading the book, it was almost like stepping into a time machine into Victorian England. It was almost as much as a study of that time as it was about Mystery of Spring Heel Jack. And in which ways do you think Spring Heel Jack was influenced by aspects of Victorian life? And then vice versa, how did Spring Heel Jack even influence aspects of Victorian life?
I think you have to remember that when Spring Heel Jack first appeared, we're looking at a period of great change. When we're moving from a time of a more rural world into a time of machinery, when everything's beginning to change and move forward. So there's always that certain sense of uncertainty of what's going on. And this is also a time when street lighting is only just beginning to appear in the main cities. So most little side roads and side streets where he usually appears were quite dark. So you've got the setting, if you like, is already there. And, you know, there are stories of this kind. There are ghostly sightings. There are beings that can't be explained who appear and disappear. And people, you know, were very willing to believe in that, I think. I think they had a capacity to believe in the unusual and the unnatural. So that everything was prepared, if you like, for this sudden appearance of this character. And it really is one of those things where the press really did go to town on it. You know, they knew a good story, and so they pushed it as much as they could. I'm sure they exaggerated it in some cases. I'm sure that some of the people who were you know, said they or claimed to have been attacked may have exaggerated it also, and may have had other kinds of attacks that they then attributed to him. So it's very easy to take it all apart in a way. I mean, you can shred it all down, you know, with your Spring-Heeled Jack claws. You can shred it right down until there's nothing much left. But at the heart of it all is this sense of kind of menace that's there. It's the menace in the shadows. And that, of course, is, you know, where you later on get, you know, you get Jack the Ripper. Again, a character who's never caught, who appears, murders horribly, and disappears again. And Spring-Heeled Jack wasn't as terrifying as that by any means, but his legend probably lent something to the legend, you know, that came after him.
Let's try and at least solve this unsolvable case, or at least pinpoint to something that the listeners can feel is more tangible of the explanation for it. And let's investigate it from both sides, because he is described as almost like a chimera at some point. He's a ghost, and of course he's also described as real people. So let's take it from each one of those angles. First, let's start with possible real culprits. And it originally was the reports, if I recall correctly, they originally attributed the first few encounters as possibly a group of rich pranksters trying to fulfill some type of bet. Is there any element of truth in that? What's your opinion on that angle?
I haven't found any evidence to support that. I feel that was one of those stories where they were trying to dismiss it. You know, they were trying to say it wasn't really serious, it was all a joke, it was all a prank. But there really isn't any evidence for that. I mean, the earliest culprit who was suggested was someone called Henry de la Poor Beresford, the 3rd Marquis of Waterford. And the reason that he was accused was that he was a well-known prankster. He had a particularly high-pitched neighing laugh, and he also had rather bulging eyes. So this accounted for two aspects in people's minds of Spring-Heeled Jack, because he was said to have eyes that gave out balls of fire. He had this terrifying laugh, and of course he liked to play jokes on people as well. He would leap out and frighten them and then disappear. So you can sort of see the thinking there, and because Henry also had a reputation as a bit of a naughty lad, it seemed as though he was a perfect contender. But as soon as people began to investigate that, they couldn't find any real evidence. He was always somewhere else. When you know, when Spring-Heeled Jack appeared, he was seen in one place, Spring-Heeled Jack appeared in another at the same time, so eventually that story went away. But I think the whole thing was partly perhaps engineered by you know, by the authorities themselves, who wanted to cool the temperature a bit by making people think, oh, it's just a bunch of boys having a bit of fun. But of course it wasn't. It was a lot more serious than that. I mean, the women who were attacked really were terrified. I mean, although I said he didn't do any serious damage, I mean, he never murdered anyone as far as we know, he never raped anyone as far as we know, but he did terrify some of these women into a state of hysteria.
Due to the working with the premise that it could be a group, due to the relatively short time in between encounters and the long distances, as well as over a very long span, can we assume that it is more than one Jack? Is it multiple Jacks? And if so, would they be in cahoots or even separate? Or,
I think that there were definitely more than one. I mean, I suspect that, to be honest, you know, the first year of sightings in 1838 were probably one person who was able to move around quite a lot, because they happen, although they happen over quite a wide area, they're mostly gathered around the east end of London, the very rough end of London at the time, but also right up into more well-to-do areas like Kensington and Hyde Park, which were more central and considered to be, well, there were a lot of homes of very wealthy people there. But I think gradually you began to see copycats. And I'm sure that after the first few, most of the ones that were still appearing then were almost certainly people thinking, I think I'll have a bit of fun, I'm going to dress up and I'm going to be Spring Hill Jack for tonight. You know, because and by that time everyone had a pretty clear idea of what he looked like. You know, he had these staring eyes, the fire coming from his mouth, he had clawed hands, he had a tight-fitting suit. I mean, you can see why later on he was considered to be alien, because he kind of fits the mark, doesn't he?
It fits within some of the physical characteristics of it. I don't even know what the hell to think of what he looks like. It's so out there, particularly for even that time. Sticking with the possibility of real culprits, to me, the most plausible who could be a real culprit was the story of Captain Finch, because he was convicted of 2 charges of assault while wearing, I guess, what would be described as a devil-like disguise, which does fit the parameters of Spring Hill Jack. Oil-like skin, horns, and I mean, the guy, I think he had a mask. What do you think about the possibility there?
He's probably the most likely suspect, I suppose. I mean, he was a military man. He is one of the people who was suspected very strongly after the Aldershot Barracks appearances. Again, he was known to have a fiery temper, to be rather wild, and to get up to mischief from time to time. And he did seem to have been absent on the night in question, and was seen perhaps creeping along the edge of the fence. So there's quite a lot of evidence there. The only thing that stops me from saying automatically that's him is because, first of all, he appears quite late on in the story, and also we don't know anything about him before this time. So you'd have to be able to place him, you know, in Peckham or Lewisham or Blackheath in 1838, and no one's ever managed to do that.
Of course, we can't really ignore the supernatural aspect of it, because, like we said before, this Spring Hill Jack was known to jump a few stories at a time, which wasn't humanly possible, and the technology didn't exist at the time, so we can't ignore this supernatural part of it. So let's do a process of elimination. Some describe him as a ghost, and I think we can probably safe to say that most likely wasn't a ghost.
I think not, because most ghostly sightings and most stories about ghosts, you don't have the physical evidence to the same extent of the attacks. Although we never found any evidence of him as a person, as a being, as a living being, the actual signs of his attacks, the scratches, the torn clothes and so forth, don't fit with the descriptions of most ghost sightings. So I think we can dismiss him as a ghost.
Well, what about a chimera of sorts, a half-human, half-animal?
Again, I don't really think that works, because the sightings don't suggest an animal-like nature, except in that ability to leap. This is definitely a man with 4 limbs, with eyes and a mouth and a face and a head, and generally the form of a human being. The only other possibility, I would say, comes out of folklore, where people sometimes have said that he must have been the devil, or a devil, because he had horns, of course. But again, nothing that really clearly indicates that, you know. I mean, the sightings that we have from earlier times of the devil are all very specific. These were too general again, and it's a very distinct figure. It's a very distinct character.
What about an alien? Because of all the out-of-this-world explanations, that one you seem to entertain the most.
I'm just fascinated by it, because I mean, it does account for the extraordinary ability to leap. If John Keel was right in suggesting that he was an alien from a planet that had greater gravity than us, that would allow for that. But if that's the case, he must have been extremely long-lived, because those stories were still being told in the 50s, during the period, of course, when, ufologists were at their height, when those stories were going on even more than they are now. So again, looking back, it's not impossible, of course, that there could have been some character, I suppose, that had been stuck here. But if so, he seems to have lived a very long time. He or she, indeed, as you said, because we don't know for sure. We assume it's a man.
There's a couple theories I want to throw out there that that you didn't really explore in the book, but I just want to get your opinion on it. What about an alternate dimension being, or even a time traveler of sorts? Because that could explain some of the more supernatural elements of it.
It could. I'm not sure that I would go along with that particularly, but I suppose if you think of a possible time traveler, which is certainly possible anyway, might have had access to the ability to do these things that we still haven't discovered ourselves, like anti-gravity boots or whatever they might be, or something like that. I mean, there's a story from as recently as 1986, back here in England again. A travelling salesman was actually driving along the road in South Herefordshire, which is quite deep in the countryside here, and he was overtaken by a man running. Now, he was driving at 50 miles an hour, so this man was going at faster than 50 miles an hour, and he ran past. No sign of springs on his heels, no sign of any kind of rocket pack or anything like that. He simply ran past, leapt over a wall, and vanished. So, the stories like that are still happening. I even have a friend who lives not far from here who believes that she may have seen something coming home one night just last year, where there was a strange light that seemed to hover over the road and then disappear off to one side, far too fast to be a bird or anything like that. So it's a little bit like all those sightings of UFOs and people being, picked up by aliens.
What do you think that this tells us about the legend of Spring Hill Jack? What do you think that tells us about the psychology of humans? Because it's something that just isn't dying, and as you pointed out, it's rooted in folklore, and it's still up to the present day.
I think we are as a species that we love mysteries. We love strange events. We love ghosts. We love monsters. I mean, you've only got to go into any bookshop and you see the number of books that are dealing with this subject. And of course, your own wonderful audience out there who are tuning into this because they want to believe, or they do believe, or they don't believe, whichever it is, but they're always fascinated by it. And I think that's gone on and on. I mean, we have these recent appearances of the Slender Man, who is a much darker figure, who's supposed to have appeared to these young women and persuaded one of them to kill her friend. I mean, this is a very dark story indeed. But there's something about the appearance of the character, dressed in black with no face, which could be seen as the same as having a mask. And people have made the comparison, not just myself, others have made that comparison. So it's as though the stories are still out there and they're still happening. And people haven't forgotten him.
Let's stick it there just for a moment, and we'll come back to... I'm gonna make you at least give us a possible answer of who you think it is. But talk about the connections to Slender Man of today, because that was a fictional tale, but then it took on a life of its own. And just do a bit of a side-by-side comparison of Slender Man and Spring Hill Jack.
Well, I mean, as you said, the story began. I mean, it's been attributed to a couple of different people at various times, but the story is supposed to have started as a kind of online game, where which told the story of children who saw this mysterious character, who influenced them, and who would almost hypnotize them, and even perhaps steal them away. And this was all done in quite a creepy kind of frightening way. And it seems to have taken on a life of its own, because it started out as this purely fictional story, but then seems to have acquired a life of its own. And we had this rather unpleasant court case a couple of years back of a girl who basically had murdered her friend and said that, you know, the Slender Man had appeared to her and told her to do this. So it's not the same exactly. You can't make an exact comparison with Spring-Heeled Jack. It's more in the appearance of the figure himself as this tall, perhaps larger-than-life character, clad in black, the sort of blank face, the ability to move quickly from place to place, sometimes in woodlands, sometimes in the middle of houses, and so on. And I think that people just saw the parallels. You know, they remembered the story again, the story of Spring-Heeled Jack that never seems to quite go away.
In the book, you also contend that the Mothman story, which many are familiar with in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, that the Mothman is actually part of can be attributed to the resurgence of interest in Spring-Heeled Jack phenomena in today. How do you mean by that? How so?
I think this is one of those things that's, you know, it's like the Slender Man story. It's an associative thing. You know, the Mothman appears and disappears. He has wings. Spring-Heeled Jack appears and disappears, and in some cases has wings. It's not so much a matter of what they do. It's more a matter of their appearance. And it seems that whenever you get a story like this, the first thing that anyone says is, this sounds like Spring-Heeled Jack. And from this sounds like Spring-Heeled Jack to this is Spring-Heeled Jack seems to happen almost immediately. It's as though the story, even though it began here, has spread across quite a lot of the world, and people remember it. And when something weird like that happens, when you get this strange character, who after all only appears for a very, very short time, almost immediately people begin to say, oh well, you know, it must be him.
What's your opinion on the idea that Spring-Heeled Jack could be a tulpa? The idea that a being or object can be created through spiritual or mind-created apparition. Essentially, it's conjured into being.
Well, I mean, that in a way is perhaps one of the most satisfactory explanations, if you like. I mean, you do get spirit presences, if you like, that seem to have been literally conjured by people focusing on them and believing in them so strongly. I mean, you know, the old, all those old stories about, you know, witch doctors pointing the bone at you and you drop dead. This comes out of a belief. You know, it isn't, I don't believe that the witch doctor has the power to do that. I think it's in the person who's been persuaded, if you like, that this is really the truth and is going to happen. And so it's their fear that kills them. And I think in the same way, something like this, which has such a strong archetypal background going right back into quite early times, has that same kind of powerful quality to it.
If let's say I put a gun to your head, do you think the original reports of Spring-Heeled Jack was a real person? Was it mass hysteria? And tell us, who do you think is the real Spring-Heeled Jack?
Well, I think it has to be said that it's probably a little bit of both. I do think that it was a real person. I doubt very much if we will ever know who it was. I certainly don't think it was the poor old Marquis with his mad laugh and rolling eyes. I think that there may have been a real person, but the question is why? Because, okay, you decide you get up one day and you think, I'm going to dress up in this weird suit with a cape, with horns, with the glowing eyes, however they managed to do it, and jump out at people. Now, this might have been a seriously disturbed person, perhaps particularly someone who didn't like women, because it's always women he attacks, or almost always anyway. So it's easy to psychologically look at it in that way. But for me, I think it goes back into a much deeper level of human consciousness. I think that, you know, as I said, folklore and traditions go on for a very long time, and in this country especially, they get remembered for a long time. So, you know, all those stories of the devil appearing in the Middle Ages, and you know, the witches flying on broomsticks and all the rest of that, didn't go seen. They remained in people's minds, they remained in people's subconscious. And I think that in the end, although we can't really point to one person or even two people and say this or that person was Spring-Heeled Jack. I think the archetype started here with something much older and then was caught up in a real person just making mischief.
So there's always going to be a Spring-Heeled Jack of sorts years from now. Maybe not Spring-Heeled Jack himself, but another character, or so to speak, because it's embedded in our psychology.
I think it's lurking in the background there, and you know, I mean, this is what I meant when I said that, you know, characters today, you know, there was a sighting, I think, in Houston, Texas in 1953, where a man was seen running down the street who had bat wings. Well, I don't know, maybe they just thought it was Batman, but they didn't say that. They said, oh, it's Spring-Heeled Jack. So it's almost as though that name, the name itself is bigger than the being, if you know what I mean. It's like it's there implanted in our subconscious, and whatever it is or was or will be, people are always going to use that name.
Does Spring-Heeled Jack ever reveal himself to you? You ever get slapped by him or a trick played on you by him?
Not so far. I did have a launch for the book in London a couple of nights ago in which Spring-Heeled Jack did make an appearance, but I'm on the best authority that it was actually someone dressed up.
No, it was really Spring-Heeled Jack.
Really? He did have red eyes and he did throw balls of light from his hands, so, you know, it must have been.
No, it sounds like my Saturday night, quite frankly. Well, I know I have you for a few more minutes, and like we said before, this is a bit of a departure from your usual topic of choice. What's next for you? Are you going to go back to it, or are you going to continue looking at other urban legends?
I'm not planning to look at any more urban legends at the moment. I'm still working on a new book about the Grail legends at the moment, which is something I have done before, but I found new evidence that I'm working on, and I'm doing I've just produced a new tarot deck, the Cathar Tarot, which is all based on the legends and myths of the Cathars. So I'm still kind of staying much in the same area that I have for most of my working life. This was a wonderful excursion, and I really enjoyed it.
I know you're a big Arthurian student. Are you familiar with Graham Phillips? I recently interviewed him about the Lost Tomb of King Arthur.
Yes, indeed, I do know Graham. Yes.
Yes. Yeah, he believes that he did find the tomb of King Arthur and then the Isle of Avalon. What are your thoughts there? Do you have do you fall into that, or you have something? What are you investigating specifically with Arthur?
I don't believe in his theory. It's not a new one, and it does fall down very easily once you start looking at the evidence for it. I'm particularly looking at the way the Grail. I'm tracing the way the Grail story developed a long time before the Middle Ages, right back in the time of Jesus, but not just with the Holy Grail, not just the whole Last Supper Grail, but something even older than that. And I think I found evidence to support that, so I'm exploring that side of it. With the Arthurian story, I'm also working on a much older Arthur, a character called Lucius Artorius Castus, who lived in the 2nd century AD. He was a Roman legionary posted to Britain. And there's a lot of evidence come to light that suggests he could have been the original Arthur. So I'm working on that too.
Ooh, tantalizing. Can we, obviously we're going to have you on and talk about that. Is there an expected time of arrival? I know these things can take a while to gestate.
This one's taking a while because there's so much research to do. I mean, I have my theory and I believe it. Quite extraordinary. In fact, I may possibly be the only researcher who was inspired by Hollywood, because it was actually working on the big King Arthur movie with Jerry Bruckheimer that I discovered this story, because their film is based on that. And I'd heard of the story before, but had never really given it much credence. And then I started to look at it and research it for the film. I found that there was much more evidence than I thought. And along with a couple of other people who were very interested in this, we've begun to look at the whole background to it. And we're finding a lot of evidence to support the idea that this Lucius Artorius, who is a real historical character whose life and death is known, could have been here in Britain. Well, we know he was here in Britain, in fact, posted up on Hadrian's Wall, and that his story influenced the later legends of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table.
Well, it sounds like we might have to set up our own little Knights of the Round Table debate discussion, you, Graham, and I, and a few others. Nothing better than a couple of Brits and Americans talking about King Arthur, in my opinion.
Well, it's a hotly contested subject, all right. Don't worry about that.
and I'll play mediator, no fighting. We don't allow that here on the Mind's Eye.
Everyone's very polite, you know that.
Yeah, you English people, to a fault almost sometimes.
Sometimes, yes. Yes.
Well, I can't wait to have you on for that one. We'll definitely discuss that. Give out your social media information, your website, all that good stuff where they can get the book before I let you go.
Absolutely. Well, the book, as you said, is The Mystery of Spring-Heeled Jack, From Victorian Legend to Steampunk Hero, which is published by Destiny Books. On sale from Amazon, in all good bookshops, as they say. And if you want to know more about my work and what I'm doing, you can go to my website, which is HalloQuest. That's HALLOWQUEST.org.uk. And there you'll find all about my other books. You can purchase them from there, and all about courses and teaching that I'm doing as well. I'm just about to go off and teach a whole weekend on the Grail, so that will be interesting.
John, I really appreciate giving us a piece of your time.
That's all right. You're welcome. I enjoyed it.
Up next, Tobias Chardin on his book, Occult Paris, The Lost Magic of the Belle Epoque. The Mind's Eye returns in a matter of moments. Let's give a big digital applause now for our next guest, Tobias Chardin, Britain's leading scholar in the field of Western esotericism. Tobias is also a filmmaker, poet, composer, author of many books, quite frankly, a Renaissance man. Thanks for coming on, Tobias.
Delighted to come down to earth.
Well, we appreciate giving us a slice of your time, especially when you're so prolific and you're dabbling in so many different areas.
I never dabble, Brian. I never dabble. I do it properly.
That's right. You go full in, like any good author does. And we're here to talk about your latest book, Occult Paris, The Lost Magic of the Belle Epoque. Now, before reading your book, I actually had no clue what the Belle Epoque was, quite frankly. So give us a quick synopsis of the book and what exactly is the Belle Epoque.
Well, the Belle Epoque is the...
And you say it so much better than I do, by the way.
The Belle Epoque is the French expression for probably one of the finest flowerings of liberal, and I don't mean that in the modern political sense, but I mean in a free... artistically creative culture in the late 19th century, what would be late Victorian England, after the 1870s, after 1871, the war with Germany, France settled down into a period of some rapid economic progress, which was also matched by great artistic freedom in Paris. And all our best ideas of Paris are really the Belle Epoque, the beautiful epoch, a great expansion of beauty and art, poetry, music, and philosophy. And this went on until the First World War rudely interrupted the progress of mankind with an orgy of barbaric violence, the echoes of which are very much with us today.
Speaking of echoes,
so it was really the last truly civilized era, I think.
Well, what do you think the biggest impact of that quote-unquote intellectual revolution had on today's world? I mean, how does it still reverberate today?
Well, I almost want to say I wish it still reverberated, but you've got to look below the surface and see the development of art as a cult. I don't mean occult, the cult of art. The idea that art has a redemptive function in society, that beauty redeems us from our own, the horror of a base life. The idea that a person who creates, a person who is inspired, is somebody who should be encouraged and is an adornment to their culture and society. The idea that we listen to music, poetry, art and beauty, and that that human creativity is itself a path to God. I think a lot of those ideas and the inspiration and enthusiasm for those comes from Paris at that period, and was exported very rapidly across the world to New York, to Moscow, to London, and it was a true centre, a pulse centre. And what my book is about is to show that the artistic pulse, the philosophical pulse, was intimately bound up with a spiritual revelation.
Why now, 100 years later, from the end of the so-called era?
Why now what?
Why now would you write this book of all times?
Well, I think it's been with me since my teen years. I was inspired very much as a young, well, I suppose teenager you'd say, by the music of Debussy and Ravel, and especially Erik Satie. And this music spoke to me of another dimension, another world. One could hear echoes of it in the music of great, pop composers like Burt Bacharach, or film music, John Barry, occasionally in the Beatles. There's just this idea that there is a form of music which takes you beyond the material vision, that touches your heart, your mind, and sort of something else as well. And I always wanted to know what it was. I always felt a connection with it. Whenever I heard about Paris in that period, I always had a feeling that in some way I'd been there, or I could connect with it. And so it was always in the back of my mind that this ought to be written about and investigated to find out what it was. Also, after I wrote my first book, proper book, The Gnostics, I met a guy called Chris McIntosh, who'd written a lovely book in 1972 called Eliphas Levi and the French Occult Revival. And it wasn't a very well-known book. It's now been republished by SUNY Press in New York. But I was very struck by this book. I felt that something had been going on in Paris that was important for our spiritual understanding and development. And I wanted to know more about it, and eventually I got the opportunity to do that. And that this book, Occult Paris, is very much the result of these echoes from childhood and from my teenage years, and I made a proper investigation of the facts.
Why did Victorian Paris at this time why was it such a hotbed for quote-unquote these outsider philosophies, these artistic and spiritual movements? I mean, what exactly was ripe about the time and the place?
Well, I think Paris, the French culture, had undergone tremors that, in a way, we are going through now in the 21st century in parts of the Western world, which was because of the French Revolution in the 1790s, had cut France off from its past to such an intense degree. There was a great insecurity that emerged over the 19th century in France, and I think this was intensified by the arrival of industrialism and the modern scientific world to France, and the soul, the feelings of people, the deeper feelings and the spiritual dimension of people was very much being put aside in a rush to modernity. And this rush to modernity we're now very familiar with, because in fact it's pretty well all we're familiar with. And there was a resistance to this in Paris. It was particularly noted because I think in France it was much more abrupt, the change, and much more extreme. In France, the church had been uprooted. The Catholic Church had been very much put on the ultra-defensive in France, and there was no national church, and there was a constant turnover of different forms of government, from Napoleon to semi-Napoleonic rule to various kinds of democracy. And this insecurity and instability, I think, bred a spiritual longing, and the French artists, being highly tuned, intelligent and well-read, responded to this with a movement that we now call decadence, which means that they were responding to the decay. Decadence means decay. A decay in their culture, feeling that things were coming to an end. Now, probably in our period, the 21st century, many people might think things have long since gone to an end, and we're left with the detritus of what might be left. You know, if we talk about making things great again, what are we really talking about? Whether you're talking about America being great again or something, what is greatness really made of? What makes a thing great? What is the difference between mediocrity and normalcy and something which is stupendous and admirable? I think these were issues that engaged the French philosophic and poetic mind at that point, and they're very relevant to today, where there is a clear problem of values in the Western world.
Do you see any parallel movements going on today that are similar to the occult to that time?
I don't think we're cut off from the period I've been writing about in Paris. I think it's a continuity to some extent, even though we've had 2 world wars and umpteen minor wars, relatively minor wars. There is in music, for those who are still interested in music, there is in cinema, there is in the visual arts, always this echo of an anarchic free spirit which wants to go beyond acceptable and merely decorative forms of art to forms of art and creativity and forms of science that go beyond the material and venture into the spiritual worlds, not content with organized or ordinary religion or sort of Protestant moral teachings, but are looking for a deeper cognizance of the spirit which we strive for, and which our culture, at least up until the 19th century and early 20th, it was believed that man's destiny was to reacquire spirit, to become spiritual beings. We are now still, as late 19th century, dealing with a kind of ocean of materialism, and we're not sure what is our true ground. The only thing most people have in common is the feeling that if they had enough money, they'd be safe from the problem. But of course, death sees an end to that. But you can always argue your way out of that as well. But of course, the questions which exercise people in Paris at this point are totally relevant to every individual today.
We keep using the word occult and occultism, and generally when people hear that word, there's a negative connotation over it, and it seems to be equated to magic. In what way are you using the word in the term French occultism? And generally it has a bad connotation over it and something negative over it. What do you think about this time frame then? Is French occultism good and bad? And in what ways are you really using the word occult?
I suppose the problem with all words is how they're understood at the time. Words change in their meaning. Occult is certainly a word that's changed. It means no more than something that's hidden. If I put a screen in front of a light, I've occulted the light. That's all it means. Or I could occult any, so much of our understanding of the world is permanently occulted by our ignorance. We'd like to understand things, but we don't understand them because it's occulted from us. It means hidden or obscured. And the occult is simply a form of knowledge which has become obscure to the ordinary mind. And that's the original meaning, and that's the meaning that they were using it in the late 19th century. Now, since Dennis Wheatley's wonderful Devil Rides Out novels and sensationalist movies, the occult now means pentagrams upside down, satanic worship, Rosemary's Baby, and hundreds of films which suggest that out there are people who eat human flesh, rape virgins, and all the rest of it. That is not the meaning of the occult at all. There you're talking about what would have gone under the term black magic. But occultism in the late 19th century encompassed things like theosophy, which was an attempt, you could call it white magic, was a form of understanding of spiritual things, which are not immediately obvious and therefore occulted. It's a deeper feeling insight and knowledge into the human being, which is not immediately apparent to the senses. And occult knowledge, therefore, was very much enlivened by the discoveries of science, that in fact all the forces that really matter, be it gravity, or radio waves are actually invisible. In fact, modern science is occult science and would have been understood as such 500 years ago, 400 years ago. It's all occult science today. Most people don't understand how you would get a rocket to the moon. They watch it on TV. They wouldn't have a clue. They wouldn't have a clue how to get that rocket there. And most of the knowledge and the technical knowledge, of course, as we know, is occulted by the state, who keep this knowledge secret from us. And so occult spiritual knowledge is knowledge which is has been obscured by the conventional religion, but it is spiritual knowledge, and that spiritual knowledge goes by the word gnosis, which is probably a better word than occult given what's happened. But every word about spiritual knowledge is always denigrated by its opponent, which has always been attacked by the ignorant who fear it.
Nowadays, the occult, as we were saying, has this connotation. Also, it's equated to magic. But was there any magic being used within the occult Paris at the time?
I think the person that interested me most was Joséphin Pelledin, who led the artistic movement, the Rose-Croix movement. And what he was trying to say was that the idea of the occult needs to be dis-occulted. And he tried to get the idea that, in fact, artistic creativity itself, the creativeness of mankind, was a magical act. Therefore, the true magic circle was the artist's studio, or even the scientist's laboratory. The act of magic is the amount of consciousness that you bring to what you do. So man becomes a magician when he is in contact with the higher mind and working on whatever he's doing. And the medieval idea of magic as a man with a wand in a circle is just an image. The true magic is done when we're truly turned on and inspired. And I think of, if you can think of any album or music that you really love, or painting, the greatest art is when the artist is the magician. And it's the same with science. The inspiration of the scientist makes the extra step. You can follow logic to a certain point, but ultimately it's down to being able to receive a new idea. And the magic of that we're talking about in the 19th century was that they were trying to find a scientific basis of magic and trying to find a magical basis for science. So it's about marrying the spiritual and the material, and that is the key. And they were aware of this in the period I'm writing about in the book, and it has its outcome in things of beauty and thought. There wasn't much interest. There was less interest in the scientific aspect at that time, although I think that's now going to be with us. I think there are a lot of people working in science who think magically, are much more aware that the universe is occult, that it's dealing with powers of the invisibility and in connection with the mind, the human mind. And the human mind is a gift of God, and it can be raised or it sinks. Now, materialism is the human mind lost in matter. And when you're lost in matter, you can only see matter. Now, the magic of the better teachers of the late 19th century Paris movement were saying we need to raise the mind. And there were ancient disciplines for this. Theurgy was one. And almost you need, if you have a ritual in your life for raising your mind to its highest potential, this is going to affect the material world, and that's where the magic is. It's that connection. And it's not this silly Harry Potter idea of magic, which is so unmagical. Harry Potter, I watched those Harry Potter movies. I don't know what they're about. I mean, when the book started, it was like for adults because it was sort of funny. It was taking the mick out of a certain kind of literature. And then the children got a version of it through the movies. And it's reinculcated this idea that magic is
is really super extraordinary. You know, I can clap my hands and the ceiling will fall down or something like this. It actually doesn't help us understand magic at all. Magic is in fact enlivening the higher mind.
Again, we're with Tobias Chardin. We're talking on his latest book, The Occult Paris, The Lost Magic of the Belle Epoque. And a lot of these artists at the time, many of them thought they were actually being directly motivated and influenced spiritually by the divine. What are your thoughts on there? I mean, were they? I
don't know. I don't think it was like a band of, you know, medieval mystics having visions. It wasn't that. I think what's interesting about the Belle Epoque occult movement was that they were very aware of this need to bring science and spirituality together and show that while science appeared to be suggesting the world was totally solid and material in the tangible or, you know, sensible sense, that actually the world was subject to all kinds of forces, of which modern science only knew a few of them. And while everyone expected this knowledge to extend to other forces, they were trying to say that the mystery of the human mind and our creativity suggests a whole other dimension of forces and life in the universe, which science couldn't really get a grip on. Every time science tried to look at the mind, it ended up talking about psychosis, neurosis, hysteria, madness. So whenever a person showed any signs of, you know, great creativity, there was, in the late 19th century, was the fear that they were going mad, and that the mind was out of control, and that the response for this was more rationalism. They should be more logical. They should be more down to earth, as we say. Now, in the process of stopping people going mad with creativity, they kind of threw the baby out the bathwater and cut off the whole inspirational thing, such that a person today who's inspired has to give a rational justification for why he's done it. You go to any art gallery today, modern art particularly, you have to have an essay next to a work, you know, what this means. And they always end up writing absolute rubbish, you know, abstract language about what this work means. And we do have this terrible problem of not accepting things that can't be rationalized. In other words, if you can't talk about a thing within the scope of the knowledge of our time, there's something wrong with what you're talking about. Whereas what these people were saying was, maybe some of these inspirations are things we don't yet understand, but we need them anyway. I think of that phrase of Jesus in the Gospels where he says, "Great, you know, you talk about my miracles, greater things than these ye shall do." So I think we're in, you know, there are periods when man feels free to explore the dimension of his mind and higher mind, and there are periods when he becomes terrified, as if there's an inquisitor on his shoulder who's going to condemn him. And I think that the media has become a kind of church, medieval church thing, controlling the way we think. And I don't think we're getting the freedom of mind that we need in this era to survive it and move on. I think progress is a natural thing. I don't think it's caused by governments or educationalists. I think progress is people learning from their experience. And what they experience is what's important. And spirituality is simply the way we are. We are spiritual beings. We're not machines. We're not computers. You know, we're not abstractions. We're living beings, and we know, we call it spiritual. It's just a word. It just means that there's something about us we don't really understand, don't know. And in that sense, occult knowledge is simply ways in to try and get into this understanding. But the idea that it's finished, or I know occultism, or here's the book, you'll understand it. No. Mankind's hardly out of the cave yet. And he's behaving like a caveman. Look at him throwing his missiles at his neighbor. You know, we are behaving like total bloody barbarian. I think of the first scene of Kubrick's 2001, with these ape-like creatures bashing each other's heads in, you know, because one stepped over the line. You've entered our territory. Oh my God, look what's going on in Europe today. We've got NATO sending its troops out to the Russian border, lest the ape Russia steps over the line, and my Christ, you know, it'll all be terrible. It's like watching a bunch of apes. It is ape-like. And human beings have not moved on beyond this stage to a huge degree. We're still wandering around picking our noses like animals. You know, and our civilization, most of it is superficial play. It's dressing up as civilized beings. We dress as civilized beings, but we think like apes.
What is the lasting legacy? I mean, what should people take away from this book, end of this time era?
Oh, a vision that a spiritual culture is a real possibility, that we can revitalize our creative powers and recover our ancient sources of wisdom, insight, truth, and move on in a great fraternal and libertarian joy of creative being, and that we can be magicians once more in a world that, once we attain that mentality, will open up in extraordinary ways. The chances of that, I suppose, if you take the view of the world that you one normally gets from the media, are very few. But I don't believe that. I think enormous changes are coming to mankind, and we stand on the brink, really, and have done for quite a long time now. And eventually, this knowledge is going to come through to us. The knowledge that flowered in late 19th century Paris, it was no different to the knowledge that flowered in 15th century Florence, or in the 2nd century in Alexandria. It's a spiritual culture, and its promise is eternal. It can always be seized on. So take that from the book.
Well, I hope we're on the cusp of that movement toward a spiritual culture, like you're saying.
Brian, let's not hope. Let's just do it.
Give out your social media information and where people can get the books before I let you go.
I have a website called tobiaschardin.com, and the details there about the new books and what I've been doing, and it's Tobias Chardin, CHURTON.com. And there's loads of stuff on the net about my books, and they're all available on Amazon. I've just had my 21st book commission, so there's plenty to catch up on.
Plenty to catch up on for us, and plenty for you to do in the future. I'm looking forward to our next conversation. Again, this was Tobias Chardin, Occult Paris, The Lost Magic of the Belly Pot. Tobias, thanks so much for giving us a mind's eye moment.
Great pleasure. Thank you, Brian.
We'll be right back on the Mind's Eye Show wrap-up. Unsolved cases and mysteries like Spring Hill Jack, the lack of answer really gives it its cultural longevity. I don't know about you, but personally me, I'm attracted almost like a magnet of sorts to mysteries, to the unknown. It also explains why, not just for a huge community behind Spring Hill Jack, but it also explains why the obvious fascination with the Bible. And that doesn't include just Catholics, the actual religious people behind it. It's time to engage your brain and enter the mind's eye, your one-stop shop for politics to paranormal and everything in between. I'm your humble host, Brian Turnov, and you're listening to Z Talk Radio. About a month and a half or so, I was visiting an old college friend for his wedding. Congratulations, George, by the way. And another old friend of mine happened to be visiting there at the same time. She was attending or working FairyCon, some convention to that effect. And she gave me a few free tickets to go see her and visit her so we can catch up. Once I got through the doors, I was blown away by the costumes, the people. A big part of the population, which I then obviously learned as I was going through, was the steampunk community. And I've heard of steampunk before, but it's never something I really saw face to face. But the intricacies of these people's costumes, the care, the characters, I mean, the community, it seemed larger than life in many ways. And I've been part of a few communities before, particularly the paranormal one. I was into a lot of conventions. Did a lot of ghost hunting across the United States. And this was a very long time ago. And it was fun, and there were characters, of course, but nothing like this. I mean, everyone was their own character. They really loved their costumes and the care and the intricacy of some of these costumes. I mean, I was blown away, quite frankly. And the one name I kept seeing and hearing was Spring-Heeled Jack. I mean, I've seen this come across my desk a couple times. This